All right, a quick one here with the topic being supplemental oxygen. So, in our 172s, we don't have pressurized cabins, and so when we get to higher altitudes, it's not as simple as just being able to fly at those altitudes. A lot changes, and the requirement for supplemental oxygen or a pressurized cabin becomes increasingly necessary. So, we're going to kind of go over the content here of high altitude flight environments and regulations, hazards, oxygen systems, the type of oxygen we have to be breathing, and then the care and storage of oxygen bottles. So, high altitude flight, technically, operations above 25,000 feet, mean sea level, MSL, are considered high altitude. However, many high altitude effects can be felt below 25,000 feet, and technically can be felt even as low as like the FAA recommendation for using supplemental oxygen at night is 5,000 feet. So the FAA has this recommendation for supplemental oxygen even as low as 5,000 feet. And so it's not just high altitude operations above 25,000 feet. The regulation requirements for supplemental oxygen are listed in FAR 91-11, and this is the 1250-1415 rule. So if we're at the altitudes of above 2,500 feet up to and including 14,000 feet for a max of 30 minutes, we need to utilize supplemental oxygen. If we're above 14,000 feet up to and including 15,000 feet, then the entire crew has to be utilizing supplemental oxygen. And then above 15,000 feet, oxygen is required for not just the crew, but for all occupants. Now, when we're talking about a pressurized cabin, there's some additional regulatory requirements. So above flight level 250 or 25,000 feet, a 10-minute supply of oxygen is required for each additional occupant. And then above flight level 350, one pilot at the controls must be wearing and using supplemental oxygen. However, if you're at or below flight level 410 and there's two pilots at the controls with quick donning masks available, then they don't need to be utilizing supplemental oxygen. But if one pilot leaves the controls, the other pilot will have to use their quick don mask. That means if you're an airline pilot and you're flying along at flight level 370, you're in between 350 and 410, and one pilot has to go use the bathroom. The pilot that's still in the cockpit flying then has to put on their mask and utilize supplemental oxygen. So the human body, we'll talk about some physiological hazards. The human body above 12,000 feet MSL, decreased oxygen saturation affects performance. So we can run into things like hypoxia, which is just a lack of oxygen. And in the case of a depressurization, at the higher altitude we are, the less TUC we have, and TUC just means time of useful consciousness. So if we're at 45,000 feet, all of a sudden we have this explosive decompression, then we only have 9-15 seconds to really make a decision and correct. At 20,000 feet, we have 30 plus minutes, but you can see with altitude, it gets exponential the higher we are. So symptoms of hypoxia include cyanosis, headaches, poor reaction time, impaired judgment, euphoria, drowsiness, headache, numbness. Symptoms for different people will vary, and your symptoms will actually change throughout your lifetime. And the treatment for this is lowering your altitude and or utilizing supplemental oxygen if available. So there's three main types of oxygen systems. There's the continuous flow, which uses a mixture of oxygen and the ambient air, and it's just a constant feed of oxygen pretty much. So if you have those nose cannulas that sit in your nose, that's a continuous flow oxygen system, and it's just constantly pushing a steady stream of oxygen into your nose. Then we have diluter demand. So this supplies oxygen only when the user inhales and can provide either 100% oxygen or mixed with the cabin air depending on the altitude that you're at. and is usable up to 40,000 feet. Now, when we get higher than 40,000 feet, this is when we use the pressure demand system. So oxygen is supplied under pressure to the person wearing the mask. So it actually takes effort and force to exhale, which can become tiring after a while, and it requires force from the user. We're not gonna be touching this pressure demand system, but it's important to understand 3 different types of oxygen systems, and because this is really only being used by like fighter pilots and stuff. The type of oxygen we breathe has to be specifically aviators breathing oxygen. So there's different requirements for different types of oxygen. So medical grade oxygen, technically we're not allowed to use, because aviators oxygen has a specific standard for a purity requirement of 99.5% oxygen. It's a different purity requirement than from other oxygens. So medical grade oxygen can have more water, and has a smaller purity requirement. And if we get to altitude and all of a sudden that water in those tanks freezes, then that can block the fuel lines, and all of a sudden we're not getting oxygen, and the pilots can become hypoxic, and that can lead to a lot of issues. So high pressure bottle care and storage. So these portable oxygen is required to be accessible in flight. These high pressure containers will specify their PSI. The bottles can be a fire danger, so keeping them away from things that could potentially ignite that oxygen. And before pre-flight, inspecting and testing all oxygen equipment as required to make sure that oxygen is safe and up to standard. And that's it. That's a really quick one there, quickly on supplemental oxygen. Thanks for watching.